Bonjour à tous.
Good morning, everybody. We're going to start the session. We're running a little bit late. We want to make sure everybody has enough time to speak and to have some questions from the audience. So we'll start the roundtable now.
Si quelqu'un veut bien avoir la gentillesse de fermer aussi la porte du fond, ça sera plus tranquille pour parler, ou au moins la rabattre partiellement. Ça. Bonjour, amiral. Oui, c'était l'inverse. Oui. Donc je vous remercie d'être venu pour assister à cette table ronde sur la frappe de la profondeur.
Okay, thank you for being here for this workshop on deep strikes. I'm going to give you a very quick introduction, a theoretical introduction to what we're going to be talking about. I'm from a research center, whereas here I have specialists in the panel, so they have greater knowledge than I do. I'd like to thank the Mediterranean Foundation for Strategic Studies for organizing this wonderful event. If we could perhaps close the door, thank you. So without any great surprise, the latest news about various conflicts taking place emphasizes the important role of deep strikes. It remains something which on a general level is not very clearly defined. To define exactly what we mean by a deep strike, I've taken an excerpt from the doctrine from 2013, which describes deep strikes. So a deep strike is an action which seeks to neutralize or destroy the adversary's resources, whether air or land, and also to weaken the decisive points and the center of gravity. On a strategic level, this action aims to attack centers of gravity and to in line with the political objective. These attacks have a major impact on the adversary's determination and their capacity to continue their action. In this definition of deep strikes, the question of the effects that is sought is very important. In this roundtable, we'll have different descriptions of operations in Ukraine, Israel, and Iran. It's an important aspect. In technical terms, the capacity to resist a deep strike will depend on the weapon system, its speed, its range, the capacity to penetrate shields through speed and also through saturation and depth. And as I said previously, the effect on the target, in other words, the precision and the payload. The precision elements are known. Another important aspect is the deep strike accuracy depends on the reconnaissance in advance. The greater the range, the more complex the system is. A deep strike which aims at mobile elements or relocatable elements means you have to have complex ISR resources, which will depend on the relative short distances, which will have an impact on spatial assets and on non-strategic assets. For dynamic strikes, this is very important. dynamic strike which will concern mobile objects. The reduction of the engagement shield is imperative. The strike takes place over a short time frame, which means this will means that the control and command will be very important. The effect of deep strike is not just a question of the missile, and in particular, in the Ukrainian conflict, we have to be careful because there is no aviation. Sometimes we see a deep strike a little bit too much, as depending on the missile system. We shouldn't forget that aviation is also an important element of a deep strike. And in any case, the impact of a deep strike depends on the complex architecture if you want to have a sustainable military impact. We shouldn't only look at the missile, we should look at the whole architecture. If you don't have the architecture with the missile will be of no use. So we're going to look at these different questions. Luckily, we have people with greater competence than I. The first part of the roundtable will be chaired by Vincent Breton, who is the director of the Inter-Army Center for Concepts, Doctrines and Experimentations. I'm changed now. I'm the director of the School of Warfare now. Okay, the information we have on the Ministry website are not necessarily up to date. I do apologize, General. So I'll allow you to give a quick overview of your career. I've been a director of the School of Warfare since September. Previously, I was at the CICDE, the Inter-Army Center for Concepts, Doctrines and Experimentation. Then we'll have a presentation by Alexis de Beauville, who is the director of the future programs of the Ariane Group, Defense Group. And then we will hear from Paul Houot from MBDA, who is currently charged in charge of commercial development and product development. If you could just say a few words about your CV in a few sentences at the start of your presentation. That way I won't make any more mistakes. So, General, over to you. I've prepared a presentation. I hope it's available. Okay, great. So I'm very happy to share with you the work on deep strikes that I've carried out with my teams as part of my previous post as director of the Warfare School. My previous position, rather, was in the Inter-Army Center for Concepts, Doctrines and Experimentations. We worked on doctrines and the future outlook, and also feedback from the Ukrainian conflict and other conflicts recently involving Israel. Last June, we produced an exploratory concept on this subject. We gave a definition of a deep strike. After this is an offensive and kinetic action aiming to attack targets located at a distance greater than 300 kilometers from the firing point. This definition is used in NATO when you talk about DPS, deep precision strike. And this distance is officially used by a weapons management protocol, which is the MTCR protocol for the Category 1 vectors. This is a very important point I should have mentioned on the slide, which isn't on it, which is here we're only talking about conventional strike capacity. When talking about deep strike, this does not include nuclear weapons. The advantage of deep strikes is to be able to fire from a considerable distance to protect those who are using these strike systems. Another important point is the French and Italian concept, considering that these strikes are precise, deep, precise strike. This precision is not such an important criterion for some of our competitors when they talk about deep strikes and not necessarily precise. Another important point is that we shouldn't confuse deep, precise strikes and a deep action. A deep action is much broader in its meaning. A deep action includes any action which takes place behind the enemy's front lines. So that includes deep strikes and also includes commando actions behind the front lines, and also raids by fighter aircraft and cyber attacks as well. All of these are deep actions. The deep strike weapons obviously carry explosive payloads, which with a many different range of impacts and effects, depending on their precision and discretion. The deep, precise strikes are able to reach the centers of gravity of the adversary. These centers of gravity may be in very remote areas, in sanctuaries, and which can be command centers. In that case, we talk about deep, precise strikes as being decisive weapons. We talk about decisive weapons, and because they are able to decapitate the command system of the adversary, and they are used in high volume, and so this means they can have an abrasive effect. The aim is to erode the military, economic, and industrial capacity of the adversary, and in that case, they're often considered to be attrition weapons. So thanks to explosives that are projected, these weapons have physical impacts, obviously, in the material field, but the physical effects, the aim can be to produce impacts in the immaterial field or intangible field. Here we're talking about deep actions to send messages to an adversary to indicate our determination and to manage possible escalation. The aim is to have a negative effect on their determination before the situation deteriorates. Stéphane mentioned this in his introduction. So to use this type of weapon effectively, this requires tremendous capacities in terms of intelligence and targeting. Our precise concept for the types of weapons that can be used for deep strikes. These can be cruise missiles. They can be remote-controlled munitions or pre-programmed munitions. This means cruise missiles that are low-cost, which we call one-way attack drones, such as the Iranian Shahed drones or the Russian Gayyan drones. We'll talk about those in a moment. And then, naturally, we have ballistic missiles and hypersonic gliders, which are part of the list as well, and also for the long-range rockets. Basically any weapon that has a range of more than 300 kilometers from their firing point. Another important point is the more diverse the equipment is, the more we complicate the defensive actions of the adversary. And this is clearly something we've been able to learn from the feedback we've had over the last few years, and especially feedback from the war in Ukraine, which I hope will come up soon. Here we are. Here we have a slide which indicates the number of Russian deep strikes since 2022. You can see a continuous increase since the summer of 2022, with peaks of 5,000 strikes per month in last July, and we even went over 6,000 last August, which is quite considerable. To illustrate what I mentioned at the beginning, the Russian deep strikes have physical and psychological impacts. This is clearly aiming for training camps, command centers, arms depots, logistical hubs, military and civilian targets as well. And the aim is to gradually the military and economic potential of Ukraine. It has an impact on the Ukrainian morale and aims to break down the determination of the Ukrainians. If we look in detail of the breakdown of these Russian deep strikes, we can see most of the increase is due to the Shahed drones, which are shown in the orange part of the bar. The Shahed drones are familiar to experts. It's designed by Iranians and are now mass-produced in Russia under the name of guerre. The Shahed or guerre drones are fired in swarms, which also include some sophisticated missiles, which are very expensive, which are shown which are represented by the blue part of each bar. High-cost cruise missiles, ballistic, supersonic, and hypersonic missiles, much more robust than the Shahed drones. So we can see the number of Shaheds fired has been increased by a factor of 20 since 2022. The number of high-cost missiles has remained fairly low and fairly constant. So the Russian concept is quite interesting. They're able to combine high-tech and low-tech, which I think is very interesting when you think of the need to have a volume effect. One of the principle is that the low cost produces saturation, and the high cost then exploits this saturation. The low-cost Shahed drones aim to produce a saturation of the Ukrainian air defenses, and by doing this, they facilitate the work of the high-performance and high-cost missiles, which are able to get through the Ukrainian defenses. The aim is to wear down the Ukrainian air defenses, and this increase in the number of strikes also obliges the Ukrainians to take the ground air defense systems away from the front line to distribute these systems right around their territory, especially around urban centers, and this means that the Russian aviation have greater freedom of action on the front line. Fortunately, the Shahed drones are no longer brought down by Western missiles such as Patriots or some T missiles. They are brought down thanks to electromagnetic means, and also by Ukrainian teams who travel right around the country. There are 1,000 Ukrainian teams located right around the country, installed on pickup trucks, and they cover the whole of the national territory. The Shahed drones are vulnerable. They are low cost and they're not very effective. They're very slow. They can't maneuver. It's not very robust. They don't go very quickly, move very quickly. Most of them are neutralized, and although we can see that the interception rate of Shaheds has gone down recently, down to about 75 or 80%. So we can see the advantage of these one-way attack drones, or remote controlled or pre-programmed drones. They really can be considered to be low-cost missiles. In fact, the saturating mass of these low-cost missiles is advantageous because then allows high-technology, high-cost missiles to then penetrate the enemy's air defenses. Then we'll look at the conflict between Israel and Iran last June. During this operation called Rising Lion, Israel, with the support of the US, with this considerable support from the US, organized a number of actions, a number of deep actions, which combined airstrikes and clandestine actions by infiltrated commando teams, and also actions in the intangible field, such as cyber actions and informational actions, and also electromagnetic actions and warfare. Israel once more demonstrated its the strength of its intelligence and targeting in the upstream phase and the planning phase, which are quite remarkable. And in the operational phase, they also demonstrated excellent integration of the multi-field actions with the capacity to synchronize effects in the different environments and fields I just mentioned. These deep actions, which also included deep strikes, were observed by us and seemed to be very well synchronized, and there were several objectives. Was to neutralize the Iranian air defense and to ensure freedom of maneuver over the areas they were interested in Iran. The Iranian air defenses had already been weakened considerably by attacks in April and October 2024. And then the second objective was also to reduce the Iranian deep strike capacity, all of the ballistic missiles and launchers and missile stocks. And the third objective was the final objective was the Rising Lion operation, was also to strike the Iranian nuclear program and also to hit the leadership of the Iranian regime. For the Iranian side, the only possible response to this Rising Lion operation consisted in deep strikes against Israel. That was the only possible response. There again, with salvos of ballistic missiles and one-way attack drones, using the same method I mentioned just now by Russia against Ukraine, with about 1,000 drones, which were fired in several waves, again, Shahed drones, and more than 500 ballistic missiles. They all have their little names. I won't give them all to you. Here you can see on this graph, which comes from an excellent article that Pierre Azou, an eminent researcher from FMES, has published. You can see here a gradual reduction in the number of ballistic missiles being fired by Iran. It's possible that Iran may have exhausted its stocks, although we're not absolutely certain of that. Maybe they've run out of missiles. Maybe they just wanted to economize and save stocks for the future. We don't know what is the case. In any case, what we can say is that despite the saturation effect that Iran was trying to develop, the Israeli IRDS, in other words, their multi-layer aerial defense system proved to be very effective. Here you can see on this slide, you can see the depth and the extent of this multi-layer defense system, which they call the Iron Dome, and then you have the David Front, and then you have the Arrow 1 and 3 systems, which were also backed up during this period by various other capacities from Israel and also from the US, with FAD batteries, fighters and helicopters and air defense systems and electronic warfare systems also deployed to create a barrier.
And so this shield was extremely effective because the 1,000 Shahed drones were taken down before even being able to reach Israeli territory. And what the Israelis say is that 90% of the ballistic missiles fired by Iran were also shot down. That's what the Israelis say. So this is a very good outcome, but it's not 100%. And I note that the Israeli aerial defense system, which is reputed to be the best in the world, is not completely watertight, has not been. It was saturated several times. And what the Israelis say is that 50 or so missiles managed to reach targets on Israeli territory, causing 30 deaths and 3,000 injured people, which is not insignificant, and I think we can come back to that in more detail later. So what I take away from this is that one ballistic confrontation, both attack form and defensive, cannot last much longer than 12 days because the two camps finally showed signs of exhaustion. And then we see that the number and the diversity of the strike systems, but also of the interceptors, complexify the situation, both defensively and in terms of attack capabilities of the two camps. And as what I was saying earlier, point 3, we see that the best ground-air defense system in the world, the Israeli system, was actually porous, even if it was 90% effective. It covers a very small geographical area. The surface area of Israel is 4% of the surface area of France. And so to reach a total effectiveness in aerial defense is a chimera. And so for a country such as France, I think we need to focus on protecting some vital points. We cannot protect everything with this type of system. Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you very much, General. And thank you for respecting the schedule. With regards to the Iranian strikes and the Israeli defense systems, it's a combination of Israel and American systems that showed that the defense was relatively watertight, and what the Americans brought technically in terms of interception zones and layers was crucial. And so that also makes us ask questions about the sustainability of anti-missile defense faced with salvos. And I think that this is quite a good transition to now ask Alexis to talk about the more technical aspects of ballistic missiles and hypersonic missiles, both in terms of what we've seen in Ukraine and what we've seen between Israel and Iran. Another interesting aspect that Alexis, I think, will be talking about are issues linked to space. And an aspect particularly of interest to us is the neutralization of airspace. Alexis, could you tell us a bit about yourself? Alexis d'Abbeville. I used to work in the nuclear deterrence for Ariane Group. Within the Ariane Group, we've been doing for more than 50 years ocean-based nuclear deterrence based on submarines. And for the French state, we are we're in charge of the evolution of the nuclear deterrent, always making sure that the nuclear shield is up and working and relevant. And so for the last 10 years, we've been looking at the type of defenses and the type of threats, ballistic and hypersonic, that we are confronted with to be able to adapt. So it is continuous monitoring which is required of us, and which allows us incrementally to make our nuclear deterrent evolve to maintain its credibility. When we look at this evolving world, there's something which is striking. Looking at China, North Korea, South Korea, Japan, Iran, the Houthis, even if they're slightly Iranian, Israel, Turkey, the United States, all those countries, and I've probably forgotten some of them, are doing conventional ballistics to do deep strikes. So long range, 300 kilometers, up to about 5,000 kilometers or more for some systems, for what we call the IRBM, intermediate range, with not... of course, there are some problems with this. When these systems will arrive, this will cause problems in terms of doctrines for their use. There's the INF issues or FNI issues, which are likely to come back regarding conventional systems in Europe and in Asia. So why this this proliferation of conventional ballistic missiles across the world that we've perhaps not particularly understood in France? Because in France, we've thought that ballistics equals deterrence equals nuclear, and we only do that, whereas all the other countries are doing conventional ballistics. Of course, France is thinking about it and doing a lot more. Why? The usefulness of a ballistic system is to push very hard, very fast, and then it goes up high, and then the gravity gives you range and speed. So it is one of the best yields to go far and fast. And when you go far and fast, you can go more or less high in the atmosphere, even go beyond the atmosphere to reach ranges which require going into space. Typically, a conventional missile of 1,000 kilometer range, you can fire it in a trajectory which will still go the atmospheric space, so under 100 kilometers in altitude. When you do this, you are at Mach 10, the impact speed of Mach 5, and you have a 1,000 kilometers in less than 10 minutes. So 500 kilometers is 5 minutes. So reactivity and strike at very high speed and range is going to go together with our thoughts about observation, orientation, and strike decision making in order to have a reaction time much higher than that of the adversary. So this will change the dynamics of war. And so we need quick decision-making systems for strikes. An extremely important point in this speed of implementation is, of course, the speed which is inherent to ballistics. But when you go high and far, you pass well beyond all the defense systems. We have the ground-air systems and anti-ballistic missile defense systems. They are two very different systems, nothing to do with each other. When we talk about multi-layered defense, the SM-3, the THAAD, and the Arrow 3 are exo-atmospheric systems which go into space. And so this is not at all relevant to a ground-air defense system. And so this often leads to confusion because the physics are not the same. The physical constraints are not the same for the interceptors of these types of ballistic missiles. Because of these trajectories, a ballistic system, it's the modern artillery or extended artillery. You go from point A to point B without worrying about what there is in between point A and point B. You just go for it. And so the preparation to the use is extremely simple. You just set the maximum altitude and that's it. So that makes you much more reactive, much faster reactions, because you don't have to do calculations about what's going on between point A and point B. So that is one of the advantages. Looking at the recent events to illustrate this, I thought before coming here, I'd look at the most recent Ukrainian declarations. Of course, it is their point of view. the figures coming from recent battles from the 20th of September. 600 missiles fired by the Russians, 579 drones, and 552 of them, 95% of them, were shot down by the Ukrainians. So the Ukrainians have got drone defense systems which are relatively effective, and I think that we could take inspiration from this. There were 32 cruise missiles, 29 of them, 99%, were shot down. And then for North Korea is supporting the Russian side, as you know. They have taken down 2 out of 8, so 25% of them. A week ago, and the Financial Times wrote an article about this, the PAC-3 no longer works for the Americans. There were 4 Iskanders, but 0 interceptions, hence the warning in the article saying, what's going on? The PAC-3 no longer manages to intercept the Iskanders because the Iskanders are able to outmaneuver them. In ballistic systems, as soon as you go beyond 500 kilometers, so the Iskander is at the limit of its range with its payload, you have entry constraints. It means if you want to be precise in targeting, and I think Paul will come back to this, to have reactivity at a given payload, you have to have precision, whereas with a nuclear deterrent, you don't need to be so precise. But with conventional weapons, you need to be precise, and precision requires you to be maneuverable. And beyond 500 kilometers in range, all of the ballistic systems needs to be able to maneuver in order to be precise, and maybe need to be able to maneuver faced with defense systems. So there's an evolution of ballistic systems beyond 500 kilometers in range, which separates an object. It could be a maneuvering bomb, which is what the Iranians have. They had a maneuverable bomb to penetrate the air defense systems and a target. And then we have the hypersonic missiles. You're trying to minimize the ballistic phase, to go high up into the high strata of the atmosphere, then to go in the exo-atmosphere and below the ground air defense systems. Sorry, to go above the ground air defense systems. We haven't seen the use of hypersonic missiles for the moment in the current conflicts. We haven't seen them in Ukraine. We haven't yet seen them in the Israel-Iran war. So what we see is the adaptation of deep strikes. 15 days apart, the Russians modified their method of attack to have a 100% penetration rate. Of course, there weren't, in fact, that many of them because they started to implement last-minute maneuvering. We knew that they existed, but before they weren't necessarily using them. So there's a permanent adaptation of attack and defense. You mentioned the Iran-Israel war, and it is very enlightening about what goes on in terms of the adaptation of the attackers versus the defenders at each stage. There was the Iran-Israel attacks in April 2024. Both were Israel was warned and everyone was expecting it, and Iran had to do a show of force, so they sent quite ancient ballistic missiles, about 100 drones and 100 cruise missiles. Only the ballistic missiles got through, and there was an interception which at a rate higher than 90% by the Israelis and the Americans, who were well positioned using their we've talked about the SEM-3. At the time, it was only that system and Israeli systems and coordination, so command and control, which was probably supported by an American air space defense system, which warns of the imminence of an attack and which starts to orientate the Israeli and American radars towards an attack. So it is quite a complex system which cannot be invented on the spot and requires extremely close cooperation from the point of view of defense. In April, the the game had been played. The Iranians sent 100 ballistic missiles. 90% of them were intercepted. Israel responded, and that joins into the debate that we had with the three chiefs of defense staff. I think it was the Israel said that felt they should do a whole lot more than just sending 100 ballistic missiles. They sent a raid of F-15s with airborne ballistic missiles. These are missiles which were modified to be able to have a range of more than 1,000 kilometers from being airdropped by the aircraft, and they have a ground air system which was protecting the latency area where a part of the Iranian nuclear complex was. So the Israelis can say that I can strike whenever I want and I can pass undetected by the defense systems. These were launched at the border between Syria and Iraq without any problems. And they didn't even fly over Iraq, and they were able to strike their targets with extreme precision. And they were able to destroy the ground air battery. It was also a rehearsal for what they did in terms of air raids to destroy the Iranian ground air systems. In October 2024, this is another phase of the war. There, more than 200 missiles were fired by the Iranians, only missiles. They stopped with their drones. More than 200 missiles in less than 20 minutes. And that's an important point. This salvo of often dozens of missiles coordinating the trajectory and coordinating the targets in less than 20 minutes, the defense system had to defend against a massive and saturating attack. I won't go into the details, but a lot of those went through the defense system. And it was very borderline in terms of defense, and the stocks of the defense systems went very low, both on the American and Israeli side. The Americans afterwards decided to install THAAD, a complementary defense system, to counter the Iranian attacks. Why? Well, because between April and October, they had changed strategy. Beyond saturation, they had sent missiles with very low trajectories, which went under the exo-atmospheric defense systems. So hence the use of the American THAAD, which was essential for the 12 days in June 2025. So it lasted 12 days and not 20 minutes. That's quite different. And so the Iranian attacks with more than 500 missiles were spread throughout time, with an Israeli attack with the first entry by F-15 fighter jets with these airborne ballistic missiles to destroy these ground air batteries on the Iranian side, and afterwards a control of the skies, control of Israeli skies above the Iranian territory to be able to destroy anything that could launch a missile. So there was a constant adaptation of the shield and the sword, with a key point, which is the modernization of ballistic missiles. We've been working on this for 50 years in terms of deterrence, but since 2024, we've seen a large-scale ballistic missile war for the first time, and now we can say this war is real. In Ukraine, it was limited, but here it was massive, and so this makes us ask a number of questions. Now to talk about the need for targeting and what the ballistic and hypersonic systems offer, we need to be able to detect the target, to be able to engage it rapidly. So a big transformation is the space domain to increase the transparency of the battlefield. Of course, there can be commandos, there can be drones, there can be, or any observation system can help you establish a situation. But at the moment, there's a massification of the ability to observe the battlefield thanks to constellations which are being deployed in the United States. It's the ballistic tracking system with a first layer with a golden dome, Trump's golden dome, which under the pretext of defending themselves also permanently scans the battlefield and also can target in a very reactive way with these ballistic and hypersonic systems. And these space systems, which are constitutive of in-depth strikes and of this high readiness, has already started. For example, in China, they're thinking about how they will be able to undo the American constellations whilst putting together roughly the same thing that the Americans have put up in space in terms of constellations. So in terms of submarines, the submarines are hidden from this space transparency, but this is going to become a key factor. And this is where the Air Force and the Space Force have their role to play. They want to try to actors try to neutralize the space constellations. So war in space is coming. And then we've got strikes from the ground to space. Some countries have done asset, destruction of weapons in space. This is the kinetic destruction, which creates debris, but when you're in war, that's no longer something that's very important. It depends on the country's doctrine. And then directed energy weapons. This is in the media, but this will be mentioned by my colleague in terms of the military space. We already fired into space in order to blind some observation satellites, which are crucial for in-depth strikes. Thank you very much, Alexis. This counter ISR is really interesting. It's a shame you can't say any more about that, but it's definitely going to become central in the anti-missile and striking issues. Now I will hand over to Paul Houot from MBDA, who is going to talk about something which is very interesting because generally very little spoken about, which is the issue of penetration of missiles and weapon systems, which is a very structuring aspect of in-depth operations. Beyond the issue of penetration is question of the payload and the maneuvering. And these are things which are very little talked about and which are within the technical scope of this roundtable. So I will thank him for being part of this panel. Perhaps you can present yourself. Thank you. Paul Houot, I'm Deputy Director of the Deep Strike product line for MBDA. It covers Exocet, which is very well known as Scalp, but also the naval cruise missile. Going back to General Redon's figures, during the three main attacks led by Iran, during the three great attacks led by Iran against Israel, more than 90% of the 800 ballistic missile fired were intercepted. This is a very significant figure. Why? Well, because it is very representative of the performance of modern defense systems. If we take Ukraine as an example, it's a country which has a patchwork of ground-air defense systems, very little integrated with warning systems which are not particularly evolved, and so the penetration is higher. But when we look at symmetrical conflict where NATO might be engaged, we need to take a close look at the Israel-Iran situation. For us at MBDA, our aim is to give a technical solution that meet the operational needs of the armed forces. Therefore, we are one of the main world suppliers of ground-air defense systems and one of the main world suppliers of ground pack. So we are at the heart of this defensive penetration and issues. And so that is why we have this debate now. In France today, MBDA is supplying, of course, the Scalp Shadow, which equips the Air Force and the Navy, but also the naval cruise missile, the MDCM, which is the French Tomahawk. We talk a lot about the Tomahawk with recent declarations from Donald Trump, but France is the only European nation to have its own sovereign Tomahawk, which can strike deep. And it equips the surface ships, but also the nuclear attack submarines. Three messages today. Our current systems work and answer our forces' needs. And we have the Stratus program, which I'll go into more detail about later. And then we are present at the European level because we believe that European cooperation is an asset. So concerning the current situation, the Air and Space Force and the Navy are using cruise missiles. Cruise missiles are useful, well, because it's already integrated on a mobile vector, a Rafale, a submarine, or a surface ship, and we'll be able to diversify the axes of attack against the enemy. So therefore, you have operational flexibility. Then you're going to follow a trajectory which has been worked on prior to the mission, which allows you to avoid overly defended spaces, and which will also allow you to use ground relays, because these cruise missiles will fly at low altitude to surprise the enemy. And when you arrive on target, you arrive at different angles, different altitudes. And we create confusion among the enemy defenses, and that is the whole point of cruise missiles. The best example that I can quote, which is fairly recent, it's the missile, a START missile, where a frigate fired a naval cruise missile, a submerged submarine fired another missile. The two missiles arrived almost simultaneously at the target, despite the submarine and the warship being located in different places. And so that illustrates the advantage of this system. And cruise missiles can therefore surprise the defenses, because you have missiles which can arrive at the same time, but from different angles and different altitudes. So that allows you to penetrate the defenses. There is an excellent video you can look at on the internet, which illustrates this, and it is made by the DGA and the French Navy. At MBDA, we have feedback from these military exercises that I've just described, but also the use of our weapons by our customers, because we equip most of the European air forces, but also many states across the world who have acquired the Rafale or the Eurofighter. And therefore, we have a lot of customer feedback, which feeds our prospects and allows us to design the missiles of the future. The idea is not to prepare for yesterday's war, nor even today's war, but to prepare for symmetrical conflict of the future. And for that, we are studying the trends emerging from the conflicts that we've mentioned today. So what have we seen? It's a truism, of course, but we're seeing an increase in conflicts across the world, and therefore a risk of symmetrical war, what we call peer-to-peer, a conventional opponent who is just as capable as us, whereas previously we were more into preparing for asymmetric wars, where NATO had a very strong capability advantage. The other aspect that we are seeing is the increase in air defenses, with the multiplication and better integration, better mobility, multi-layer systems, which are becoming more and more performing. And therefore, the threats need to evolve when you talk about electronic warfare, and therefore the jamming capabilities of the GPS systems used by missiles. So if your missile only uses GPS navigation, you risk being jammed by the defensive systems. And we see that in Ukraine this works extremely well. What we also see is the risk of losing air supremacy, or at least to not be able to protect it in time for NATO because of this increase in threats. From the attacker side is a massification that the General Breton described with the one-way attack effectors, with the Geran from Russia, or the Iranian Shaheds, which are used to saturate the defenses, but also for mass bombing. And so we see recourse to this kind of saturation, making use of the massive effect. What does this inspire us today? And I was talking about the Stratus program. That was my second point about preparing for the future. We have been working with 750 engineers now for quite a long time on this program, what's called future anti-ship missile, or anti-ship cruise missile. It is one common system, 2 complementary missiles for 4 critical missions. Of course, ground strike, the anti-surface sea missile, and then the neutralization of air defenses and destruction of air defenses. Another critical mission is the destruction of high-value aircraft, AWACS, for NATO, the surveillance aircraft which are there to detect airborne threats. So this is a critical capability today. We had somewhat forgotten it during previous conflicts. We were mostly looking at asymmetrical conflicts, but today we see that we need to create corridors in these defenses that we are confronted with. So there'll be 2 missiles. The first is the rapid strike Stratus, which is above in the photo, which is the missile which will give back to the Air Force and the Navy its capability to destroy air defenses. And for that, it will combine 2 things, high speed and high maneuverability. Both are essential. If you are only fast, simply evasive, you are weak in front of the different current defense systems, such as the Russians have. And so we need terminal maneuverability to overcome this. The other missile that we see is the low observable status, because it is extremely furtive.
It will be active. The furtivity will be active and passive. It will seek to escape radar and infrared detection. We work on this kind of missile and the materials to reduce as far as possible the signature of the missile, and it will fly at very low altitude to escape detection. So these 2 missiles, which are complementary in the way they are used to attack targets, different targets. Today we have 3 penetration modes: speed, maneuverability, furtiveness, and then we also have the collaborative combat. Collaborative combat means the capacity to work, to have several missiles working together in real time. You'll have salvos of missiles, as we see in Ukraine. Instead of having a simple saturation with sending lots of different missiles, you'll be able to use intelligent saturation. So this means you will send salvos where there will be missiles, attack drones, and also rebel carriers, which are as part of the program, future attack drone program, to have several different types of threat being sent. And this here we use technology and AI to get them to collaborate together. 2 years ago at the Paris Air Show, we developed a concept called Orchestra Strike, which means we manage this intermissile combined combat system with 3 different types of penetration being combined. When you say this, you get the impression that penetration is the main objective of missiles, because that is the subject of our round table. Of course, it's not the only criterion for a missile. I would say there are 4 major criteria to bear in mind. First of all, penetration or survival. Then the range, once again with France, which is the only conventional missile capable of exceeding 1,000 kilometers an hour. And then the terminal effect. This is the combination of precision and lethality. If you have a small explosive load and you're precise, your lethal effect will be quite low, because your military impact will be reduced. If you want to hit command posts, which are protected and hardened, you have to be extremely precise, and you must have a payload adapted to the penetration, capable of penetrating the defense. That is the mission of the Scalp. And we have cases in operation where 2 Scalp missiles were fired against a buried underground command post. They went through the same hole. This is what we call metric precision. The last criterion is what we call price. And here I'm talking to US taxpayers also. In the budgetary debate that is going on at the moment, you have to have prices which are acceptable in the long term. We talk a lot about hypersonic missiles. But hypersonic missiles will be kept for very specific needs. If we took the hypersonic glider project, the Dark Eagle American project, the American Congress are talking about a unit price of $40 to $50 million for each of these gliders. Even for the US as a $600 billion project per year, that is a lot of money. So that means they will only use it in very specific cases. If we're talking about saturation with ballistic missiles, such as Iran, the cost of the strike is huge because you're sending missiles worth several $million each against a defended objective, so that cost is very high. That's why Russians seek to achieve saturation with low-cost drones, followed up with ballistic and cruise missiles. So those are the four major criteria when you want to analyze the effectiveness of a missile. And finally, my last point. I have a little bit of time left, I think. My last point is the European cooperation. When you read the media today, you get the impression European cooperation is complicated. Nobody wants to do that. But as Admiral Vondier said, we have no choice. We have to cooperate at the European level. MBDA is a tool for the politicians to help this, assist in this European cooperation. It was born with European cooperation with the Storm Shadow European program. So it's a missile that is used by the British Navy and the French Navy. And of course, there are other armies as well now. Cooperation is a good thing because we will pool our budgetary resources, we pool our human resources, and as we want to have a high volume, this reduces the unit cost. And this is very interesting for the army and for the taxpayers. And when we want to reach high-level technological capacity, we have to be able to make use of innovation through Europe. That's important too. So that's why the Stratus program is being conducted in cooperation with Britain and Italy and France together. The objective here is that when you need to fight at the level of NATO, because in principle the European countries could be fighting against a single enemy, when you have the same weapons, it's much easier to work together. So you're also maximizing interoperability of different forces using the same weapons. This means these missiles will be used by Italy, Britain, and France, who will be able to implement them together. At MBDA, we have an approach which consists in saying we have to operate. We've created the tools and the culture, and we have the experience in successful cooperation in the past. Not something you can invent. It's something we have to work on in the long term. So to conclude, I would like to repeat my three messages. Our current systems give operational supremacy to our armies, and we've had the feedback from our customers telling this is the case. We're already working on the programs for tomorrow to maintain this operational supremacy with a Stratus program in cooperation with Italy and Britain. And we're doing this in cooperation with Italy and Britain because we believe it's vital in order to achieve this performance. And finally, I would like to quote our former Minister of the Armies, Mr. Lecornu, when he relaunched production of the Scalp missiles with the UK, who said, "We are providing Ukraine with the Scalp Storm Shadow missile, and it has demonstrated its effectiveness for modern high-intensity combat in decisive situations." In other words, it penetrates. Thank you very much for your attention. Thank you very much, Paul. As moderator, I may have a few questions to ask. We don't have much time left, so I will hand over to the questions from the audience, perhaps now. I suggest that when you ask your question, it may be interesting to see if there may be some differences between atmospheric and non-atmospheric systems and the question of penetration, and also perhaps questions about the cost and the ratio of cost to impact. There are many different questions that can be asked. If you could please ask a question which is brief and incisive, that will be more fun. So please go ahead. You can now ask your questions. They're on the screen. Which one do you prefer? Well, we'll take them in order. Yes, the limit of bombers in disputed airspace, that is something, that's nothing new there. That's why it's necessary to clean up before you send aircraft into disputed areas. This is what the Israelis did before they attacked Iran. First of all, they destroyed the air defense systems. So the answer is yes. Yes, you're talking about the volume. I think that volume means a question of combining low-tech and high-tech systems. I think I showed in my slides the advantage of using these two types of systems to build up this mass or volume. The volume creates a saturation, and then high-tech high-cost systems then can then penetrate. You have to have a variety of different systems. That makes the defensive strategy more complicated for your enemy. The Israeli raid, if you look at that Israeli raid, it's very enlightening. These are fighter bombers. They have their own radius of action, and they are able to fire the weapon from a distance of more than 1,000 kilometers. So they have a great future. They can have several possibilities of action, and they are able to have a variety of trajectory and of range. To talk about the latest Israeli raid, this is a rather unusual deep strike. This is a deep strike against the Hamas leaders in Doha. I don't know if that'll be part of our doctrine. I doubt it very much. In any case, they went down the Red Sea very quickly, and they fired at near the Saudi border. The ballistic missile overflew Saudi Arabia, went behind the American Patriot 3 batteries, and hit this target. The bombers we are talking about are not the Second World War bombers. They don't bomb from overhead. They bomb from a distance over several hundred or even 1,000 kilometers. And maybe we talk about very high altitude. Very high altitude is does that have a future for deep penetration strikes? Yes, of course. When you talk about ballistic or hypersonic systems or gliders who glide at high altitude, at very high altitude, that's between 30 and 100 kilometers. The area where there's less air, and near the frontiers of outer space. So these systems are used at very high altitude. Then the question is how you can intercept them at very high altitude. That raises a lot of problems because there's not much air or hardly any air at all. Question which challenges the sponsor, and I'll answer Mr. Berger. What agility do we have in France in NATO to deal with a potential enemy carrying out deep strikes? Your question raises the question of the industrial capacity to deal with high volume. And certainly the government has decreed that there will be a war economy, and this means that industry can no longer just provide a product and performance. We have to provide a solution. So it's a product and the capacity to produce at high volume. This means your industry has to be robust, and you also have to have experts who take a long time to train, who are able to produce at high volume, mass production. This means you have to have a very robust subcontracting train. We have 2,000 subcontractors mobilized for the war economy in France, and this requires huge investment as well. And when you talk about mass production, we're talking about huge investment as well. MBDA is investing 2.4 billion euros through the group to increase its production capacity. We are increasing more than 2,000 people per year. So if there are young people in the room, we have a very large-scale recruitment process at the moment. When we talk about agility, it's also a question of changing your operating mode. When we're talking about high-performance drones, you can partner with players who are in the civilian sector. So that means you're doing things in a different way. And finally, the last point about agility is exploiting synergies and identifying synergies, first of all. And finally, the point, we have our land cruise missile, which is presented as part of the ELSA European initiative to strengthen great depth facilities. So we take an existing missile France has invested in for 20 years. We put it on a land carrier, a truck. This gives a defense capacity to Eastern European countries, which is very interesting, very useful, and extremely gives a great deterrent. So I think what we're talking about here is the importance of having strong industrial capacity in order to produce these missile systems. You can't have a completely watertight shield to protect Europe against deep strikes. That's not possible. So the aim, above all, is to dissuade, to deter potential enemies from attacking us with deep strikes. That is the basic objective. Just to talk once more about the idea of a shield. When we have a determined enemy, the shield will have holes in it. We've seen it in Iran with the attacks in October. What you have to remember is that we talk about high volumes, deterrence weapons, and attrition weapons. When you look at Russia, they in May last year they fired 6 Kinjals. Which is like a scandal. To fire the 6, they wanted to destroy the ground air systems, the American systems. They went opposite the cannon. The mission was to go opposite the cannon. The Ukrainians fired several Patriot systems for 1 Kinjal, so they exhausted their stock. With 6 Kinjals, there was no longer any Patriot systems left. A Patriot cost 3 million. Kinjal cost about 5 or 6 million. So the big missiles with bigger payloads have done the work, and the drones then went through. So you have to be careful when talking about high precision weapons, ballistic systems. They carried out attrition of our defense systems. Some people have a different conception of the use of these missiles than we might imagine. I fully support Alexei in what he says. A highly penetrative system which consumes 15 or 20 interceptors is a system which, in terms of penetration, is superior to any other existing system. So we need to think about how we prioritize, especially for the specific air defense missions. 1 Kinjal is worth 10 Patriot systems, and the penetration of the interception rate of the AS-24 is not as good, but the missile doesn't need any support to go through. If you have an interception rate of 10% of the US-26, you don't have to have a lot of things to support it. It flies by itself. So the question is the question of ISR. It's not a question of the missile. The missile performs its function. Here there is something we need to think about, because in the public debate, sometimes there's a little bit of confusion what a mass or volume allows and what penetration allows. Thank you. I'd like to ask the A3 question. Do the capacities of this program reveal weaknesses of DCM? When you have subsonic missiles, people say it's too slow and too visible. The reality is that the DCM is more recent than the Tomahawk, and we never asked the question about the penetration of European Tomahawks, which are Ukrainian ones. So the DCM was put into operation in 2007. The first Tomahawk was in 2003. So there's a few years difference between those two. I would say the Stratus adds to the range of capacity of our armies with a very maneuverable supersonic system, but Stratus and Halo will be a subsonic system like the DCN, but will be more furtive. So it's a change of generation, because the stratus we're talking about are the next few years of this decade in terms of the need. MBDA plans to manufacture remote-operated low-cost munition, as we presented at the Paris Air Show. This is a one-way vector, which was presented by our president, which will meet this need to create volume, to create saturation, and we have that in France, and we also have a proposal from the UK with a crossbow, which is a low-cost cruise missile, which aims to intervene above 100 kilometers. So it's between the penetrating cruise missile and the missile designed to saturate. So we have different concepts depending on the needs of the army. And then there's another point where when you need to use, and there's a point about AI. MBDA last year created Arresto Systems, which is dedicated to development of algorithms based on AI to accelerate the detection and strike loop. Today, we are working on a system called Grand Warden, which aims to accelerate target identification for Aker MP systems, which is an anti-tank system which is used by the land army. These are the points I wanted to emphasize in terms of our action at MBDA. Maybe just to be fair, because Alexei didn't say very much about what his company was doing in this area. Maybe, Alexei, you could tell us a little bit about what your company does. You can read it in the press. We are having discussions with the French Ministry of Army. And on the European level, the ELSA, European Long Strike Approach program. This is started with a diplomatic initiative and common interests. There are 11 themes to this initiative, whether it's for cruise missiles or hypersonic ballistic missiles or other objects as well. There is a lot of European research in this area. We are also working in these areas. I don't want to say too much at the moment. Okay, fine. I think it's time for us to maybe end, unless we have a question from the audience. Okay, we'll stop it there. Thank you very much.